Hey there, welcome to Can't Make This Up. If you're new around here, my name's Kevin, and I get the privilege of sitting down and talking with some really interesting writers and historians and just picking their brain about various topics in history. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking with a professor from the University of Sussex. His name's David Hendy, and he's written an interesting history of the BBC. The BBC is today, a very well-known international news site. But where did it come from? David and I were going to talk about the founders of the BBC, how it kind of pioneered the new medium of radio, innovative programming for that medium, and kind of the role that it played in becoming this indispensable institution for the UK. If you're interested, a couple of recommendations that I have personally with the BBC. I really enjoy listening to In Our Time. It's a history podcast where Melvin Bragg sits down he gets a round table together of various historical experts, and they talk about a topic for about a half hour or so. I really enjoy that. Another really good BBC podcast from BBC Radio 4 is called Beyond Belief. Kind of the same premise, except dealing with religion. They'll take a religious topic like death, for instance, or heaven or salvation, and they'll get together a Catholic priest and an imam and a rabbi in a round table, and they'll all talk about their different perspectives. Super interesting stuff. So if you're in that kind of vein of things and you want some good quality programming, a couple of really cool BBC podcasts for you. If you're new around here, please, like and subscribe to the podcast through whatever you're listening to this on. If you're on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe there so you can see new content when it drops every few weeks. If you're on social media, I'm at CMTU History on pretty much all the social medias. And then if you'd like to support the podcast, if you've been listening for a while, and you'd like to help me out, produce more episodes, head on over to Patreon. I'm going to be dropping some bonus Q&A from David here tomorrow, so you can check that out. And, if you don't want to help out and support the podcast, that's okay too. No sweat. I'm happy to have you here regardless. So, without further ado, here's my interview with David Hendy.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
You're listening to You Can't Make This Up. I'm your host, Kevin, and joining me today is David Hendy. David, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Very good. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Well, I suppose I should explain that when it comes to writing a history of the BBC, I do that as both an insider and an outsider. So I'm an academic historian, and I've spent 25 years or more studying the BBC, writing about the BBC. But before that, I worked for the BBC for 7 years. So I worked as a producer in news and current affairs. And I suppose that informed, I hope in some level, but that's not too obvious, but fairly subtle, the approach I had to writing the history of the BBC. Because the BBC is this, in the UK, it's this grand cultural institution, which is very central to British life. And because of that, we tend to think of it as a kind of, a grand cultural institution, very formal. And I think a lot of people assume that in broadcasting, programs are made to order, and it's a sort of top-down organization and so on. That didn't match my experience, and in many ways I wanted to approach the story of the BBC in a way that was less about it as an institution and more about it as a kind of creative community. And I wanted the program maker's perspective to kind of run like a thread right through the story of the BBC, because from my point of view, broadcasting is made by broadcasters. It is, for many years of its history, a kind of thoroughly handcrafted thing. And obviously, from the perspective of now in 2022, I mean, broadcasting is a massive industry. Television, radio, the internet, it's an industry. But when it began, when the BBC began in 1922, it was a handful of individuals, and they had a kind of blank slate, and they had to work out as they went along, what is this thing, broadcasting? And getting back to that idea of what it was like at the beginning, I think was really, really important. And I had in my approach, I suppose, the words in my mind of the historian John Eliot. He's not a historian of broadcasting, he's a historian of imperial Spain. But he made a really interesting point about what's the task of the historian. And he described it like this. I'm going to quote his words. He said, the task is to enter imaginatively into the life of a society remote in time and place, and produce a plausible explanation of why its inhabitants thought and behaved as they did.
Ooh, I like that. I like that.
Yeah, isn't that great? And it's it's a kind of inclusive, imaginative idea of history. And in a sense, that's the simple task I set myself, is how do I get into this institution and think of it as a kind of community, a society? And why did they do what they did? What was the thinking behind all these programs that have become part of our life? And how did that turn a simple radio organization, if you like, into something that became so important in British society and actually important globally as a broadcasting institution?
In reading the book, you do feel, I think you did a good job with this, because you kind of feel like you're in the broadcast room, at Savoy Hill, or as it moves along, you feel like you're kind of right there with them, and you did a very good job with that.
Thank you. But in a way, I was helped by one of the main resources of the BBC that was put to my disposal. Now, the BBC, as a grand institution, 100 years old, is both a nightmare and a dream for the historian who's researching it. It's a dream because, well, it's so interesting, right? I mean, this kind of creative process, and it's stuffed full of creative, articulate people. And it's a nightmare because it's such a vast terrain. I mean, the BBC itself has broadcast somewhere between 10 and 20 million programs. It's impossible to put a figure on it, right? But that's a lot of programs. So you know that if you're trying to tell the history of the BBC, you're going to be able to only reference and tell the story of just a tiny proportion of its output. It's employed tens of thousands of people, and its written archives, which I think are almost the best archives in the whole of Britain, are extraordinary, because what you've got is an organization stuffed full of creative people, but it's also got a sort of temperament a bit like kind of the British civil service, which means that all their interesting discussions behind the scenes about why they're making programs and what they're trying to do have been captured in memos and policy papers and so on, which means
wonderful for you.
Wonderful, but it would take several lifetimes to kind of work through it. So again, you have to be quite selective. But what helped me, I think, to achieve, what you kindly referred to as kind of a sense of being there, is a kind of fairly underused resource in the BBC's archives, and that's the BBC's oral history archive. Now, this is something which hasn't actually been kind of terribly accessible to researchers. So what is it? In 1972, when the BBC was just 50 years old, and it was celebrating its 50th birthday, there was someone at the BBC, Frank Gillard. He'd been a wartime correspondent, and they had a party at the BBC to celebrate its 50th birthday, and he looked around at all the guests, all these grand BBC figures from the past who'd been invited, and he suddenly realized that they were going to die soon, and actually their memories should be captured. So in 1972, the BBC started systematically recording, first of all on audio tape and then later on film, sustained interviews with key members of staff at the point at which they were retiring or they were leaving the BBC, and they were told, look, you can speak frankly, it's not going to affect your career now. You can be rude about people. You can say, what really happened? What happened in the Second World War when this happened? What about the coronation of the Queen? Tell us the inside story. Yes, the invention of television. Tell us, exactly how that unfolded. Suez, the Falklands War, and so on. And so what you have, and by and large it's been kept under lock and key, is recordings of about 600 interviews with former members of staff. It could be right from the top, directors general and governors, right through the program makers like David Attenborough, who we tend to think of as someone who presents natural history documentaries, but actually joined the BBC in 1952 as a producer behind the scenes. Engineers, secretaries, people who work in the duplicating department, on one occasion the lift attendant. And so what you've got with these 600 interviews, and 8 years ago I was given, very lucky to be given privileged access to these, is a chance to kind of recover these human stories. Now, and these oral history interviews, they offer a kind of ringside seat on the kind of BBC's history, and not just the BBC's history, but kind of the history of Britain in a way, because the BBC is there, the BBC people are there during the coronation or the war and so on, and they're astonishingly frank at times, but perhaps best of all, they're wonderfully atmospheric. They take you into the production office, they take you into the studio. You get very often several accounts of the same thing happening. So when it comes to General de Gaulle arriving at the BBC in 1940 to make his appeal to the French to resist the German occupation, you have 3 or 4 accounts of the general arriving and what he's like and how he behaves and and they're rather frank about the fact that he has a bit of
things that weren't put down on paper.
Yeah, exactly. The thing that, for instance, that actually he was a bit tricky and he had a bit of a tantrum, and he was had a rather grand view of himself and what he was being allowed to do. And yeah, so yes, you get. I mean, they're sort of gossipy. It's the stuff that's unwritten, but also it is a genuinely informative resource because you can see an event from several different perspectives and you get a sense of what it was like to be there. So really I suppose what I tried to do with the book was to say, well, this is a history of the BBC, and there have been histories of the BBC in the past. There's a 5-volume official history, 4,000 pages by Asa Briggs, wonderful thing, and then there's a 6th volume, another 400 pages. But what am I trying to do? If I'm trying to do that whole history in one book, I'm going to try and put the people center stage and draw as much as possible on those eyewitness accounts, and to try and I hope it's a kind of an involved and at times emotional journey for the reader. I mean, I want the reader to kind of feel angry at various points or moved and upset. I mean, for me, some of the sections on the Second World War, I found profoundly moving as I was researching them, to hear the accounts of what it was like to work at the BBC in Britain during the Blitz, when the BBC itself was being targeted, and for broadcasters to be putting their bodies on the line and to be kind of trying to find a way to kind of exist and survive and to keep broadcasting on air against all odds, and broadcasters who are passionately committed to the anti-fascist cause as well, who were kind of really believed that what they were doing in keeping going, in broadcasting to occupied Europe, for instance, was a vital part of the war work. So, yeah, I do want readers, I hope readers can feel to some extent this is not just an informative ride, but an emotional ride to kind of to live with and to walk alongside these broadcasters through the 20th century.
Well, your book, and it's the BBC, a Century on the Air. It's not 4,000 pages, which is good. But it is a good sized book, but very approachable. And I think maybe it might be best at this point because we have a majority American audience for this podcast. Can you kind of explain to us kind of what is the BBC and how is it structured? Because here in the States, we don't. I mean, we have PBS, public broadcasting, but it's kind of on the margins. It's on the side, and so I don't think it quite translates to an American audience exactly how central the BBC is.
Yeah, I mean, it's been said. It's been said that you can't understand Britain without understanding the BBC, and it's also been said that the BBC is, you have to think of it as a bit like the Church of England or Parliament or the monarchy. It is almost like an organ of state, if you like. But the crucial thing about it is that even though it's like an organ of state, it feels as if it's part of the Constitution. It is not a state broadcaster, nor is it a commercial broadcaster. So it is a public service broadcaster, but it's a public service broadcaster that is not funded by a kind of a generous allocation of taxpayers' money by the state. It's not funded by kind of fundraising. It's funded by the license fee, as it's called. And the license fee is something that was there right at the beginning of the BBC, which is that you have to have a license to own in the early days, a radio set, and later on a TV set. And it's pretty universal. In other words, pretty well every household in the country will pay the license fee. And so that goes directly to funding the BBC. Now, what that means is it's owned by us, as it were. And it's also not just owned by us, but it's used by most of us. So, I mean, you will know better than me what proportion, say, of the US population would be tuning into a public broadcaster in a given week.
Some people really enjoy it, but the majority of people are not tuning into PBS.
Yeah. Well, so in the UK, in any given week, BBC services are used by 99% of households. Okay, so, and when it comes to now, that means that in a given household, someone at some point during that week will have kind of used a BBC service in some way. And when it comes to individuals, it's about 91%, right? So it's still a lot of people. In other words, it's the most used news site. And I mean, there are other things you can say about the BBC. It's the biggest news organization in the world in terms of the number of journalists it employs and the number of overseas bureaus and so on. It's still, by some way, the largest commissioner of drama in the world, because it kind of has dramas every day that are new and newly commissioned on its radio networks and so on. Not necessarily the same amount of money that's sloshing around as, say, with Netflix, but in terms of the kind of quantity of new writing and so on. So the scale of the BBC, it's got a budget which is in the several billions, and it broadcasts internationally in over 40 languages, and it's got a global reach in terms of population listening and watching of somewhere between 450 and 500 million around the world. So now, I mean,
and that's not just radio today.
And that's not just radio, it's internet and it's television and so on. Now, I mean, the origins of the BBC, I think, are really important, because there's something about the DNA and its ethos which is important to its identity and its place within Britain.
Coming out of the ashes of World War I.
Yes. So 1922, I mean, radio as a technology is already, it's been around for about 25 years by 1922, right? It's not brand new. But what is important in 1922 is that, you know, it's only 4 years after the end of the First World War. And that was a traumatic experience for, you know, for British society. And a lot of people come out of the First World War despairing at civilization. You know, in other words, civilization seemed to have slipped into barbarism, and this felt as if it was the end of progress. And there were other people who came out of the First World War thinking, well, actually, no, this is what makes it even more important to build a new and better world. How are we going to increase mutual understanding? How are we going to kind of hold society together and end hostility between nations and redeem humanity and preserve civilization? And you know, one of the reasons I start the book by focusing on just 3 individuals, 3 men who I regard as the creative nucleus of the BBC in 1922. It was a very small organization. It started very, very modestly. Who were these 3 men? These were 3 men who emerged from the First World War with a very vague but heartfelt desire to improve the world in some way. So you have, for instance, John Reith, who becomes the first general manager of the BBC, and he's been brought up in a deeply religious household in Glasgow, and he's come out through the war with a sort of sense of destiny. He's, you know, this religious upbringing makes him feel as if he has to serve God by serving the public in some way, but he doesn't know how exactly. Then there's Cecil Lewis, who's the deputy director of programs. He's only 24, Cecil Lewis, when the BBC starts, and he'd been a teenage fighter pilot in the war, and he'd looked down on the trenches below. I mean, he'd been exhilarated by flying. He kind of loved the experience, but he looked down and became increasingly despairing at the destruction he saw below and the death and so on. And he emerges from the war thinking, how do we increase mutual understanding? How do we end this kind of hostility? And for him, it was going to be maybe through art or poetry or music, but he wasn't quite sure how. And then the third person in this kind of mix is Arthur Burrows. And he's the one person who does know about radio because he's worked for the Marconi company and he spent part of the war eavesdropping on enemy radio propaganda, wireless propaganda. And he was horrified at the disinformation that he said was spreading through the ether, as he put it, like poison gas. And he thought, well, look, if this is so powerful at changing people's minds potentially in a bad way, what about using it in a good way to spread what he called a doctrine of common sense, to spread good information? And in a sense, all 3 of them emerge, and if you kind of wind together their kind of hopes and their ambitions, what you get is the kind of DNA of the BBC, and they're all, in a way, inheriting the spirit of a Victorian writer, Matthew Arnold, who'd written a very influential book in 1869 called Culture and Anarchy, and it was still being read very widely in Britain in the years after the war. And in Culture and Anarchy, Matthew Arnold had said, look, what is going to hold society together? What is going to redeem humanity in an increasingly post-religious age? And he said, it's culture, or he called it sweetness and light. And he said, it's no good just a few people having access to culture. What's going to make this work is if everyone is part of this. The task, he said, was to make sweetness and light prevail. And this idea is kind of taken up by John Reith and Cecil Lewis and Arthur Burrows and the people who start the BBC, because they see radio as the technical means to hand to achieve this grand social purpose, which is to spread good information and culture. So, you know, to paraphrase Reith, and Burrows and Lewis, one of their famous articulations of this philosophy was that the task was to bring the best that has been thought and said and done to as many homes as possible. And that second part of that sentence was just as important to them as the first part. It wasn't just about, yeah, let's have a really good, solid information service and news and culture and opera and classical music and the canon of literature. It was, we have to bring that to as many people as possible. It has to be for everyone, and it has to be for everyone equally. And
classes and demographics.
Yeah, so and the best also was quite broadly defined, because the thinking was, that the life well lived wasn't just a life of virtue, it was a life of pleasure and relaxation. That at the end of a day's work, we needed relaxation. So entertainment was part of the mix right from the beginning. It wasn't all about kind of, austere uplift and so on. It was about a balanced range of programs. So right at the heart of the identity of the BBC is it's for everyone, right? So it's important that it is it becomes a national broadcaster by design and by hope. But it's bringing to everyone equally the full range of programming, not just news, but entertainment and drama and music of every kind and so on. And that's always been an important part of the BBC. It's not a niche broadcaster. It doesn't specialize in news.
And I'm struck by how this is the exact opposite of what any marketing seminar would tell you today on how to market your product. Find your niche, cater to it.
Yes, and of course that in a sense is part of the identity of the BBC, is that it stands outside that commercial market sort of mentality, deliberately stands outside of it. Now, does that mean that the BBC is not interested in audiences or ratings? No, it's always got to be interested in ratings, because it wants to bring the best to everyone. And if people are not tuning in, if people are not listening to the BBC or watching BBC programs, then how then can it improve society? How then can it say it's leaving the world a better place than it finds it? So inherent in the BBC's design is not just that it becomes a kind of a national institution in order to kind of reach all corners of the land, but that it's constantly grappling, its program makers are grappling with, how do we manage this tension between offering the good stuff, but making sure that we are not so far ahead of public taste that we leave people behind, right? So the idea was that the BBC would be just a little bit ahead of the public taste in the hope that it could nudge people to follow it, right? It would constantly introduce people to new music and new ideas and so on, but it wouldn't be too kind of traumatic, and it would also give people some things that they liked and already were familiar with. And this idea has been thought about and argued about behind the scenes constantly, and one or two people have managed to articulate, what are they trying to do. There was a television producer in the 1950s called Hugh Weldon, who said the BBC's goal is to make the good popular and the popular good. And that was a really neat kind of encapsulation, if you like, of what the BBC was trying to do throughout its history.
Hey guys, Kevin here. I wanted to share with you a new development with the podcast. It is coming to you from a new podcast hosting service, anchor.fm. So far, I'm really impressed. I really like it. Number one, it's free, which is always great. It's also integrated with Spotify and offers some great analytics on who's listening. Helps me gain some insight into what content would be good for the audience. And you can also record from your phone, which is a nice new feature that I'm using right now. So if you have a podcast or you're interested in starting one, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
So kind of in a pragmatic sense, what did that look like in the early days? Like, what kind of programs were they offering?
I mean, right at the beginning, they had no idea what to offer, really. And one of the things that Reith says is that when he started, they were, as he put it, no sealed orders to open. They had a blank slate. They didn't get much help from the newspapers, who insisted on a rule that the BBC could not include news bulletins until the evening, so that newspaper sales weren't affected. A lot of theatres and music companies and so on didn't want to cooperate. They were just ready to try and kill off this rival right at the beginning. And so actually the handful of producers who worked at the BBC had to kind of make things up as they went along. They did kind of sketches from shows, variety, readings from books, children's programmes were there from the beginning. The BBC pretty quickly had to start assembling its own orchestras and dance bands and so on, because it didn't get cooperation from external companies and orchestras and so on. It created its own repertory company of actors, so it could do plays. Talks were important right from the beginning, and those talks, it covered a wide range of stuff. It could be a kind of rather frothy throwaway chat about a foggy day in London, or how to tin sardines, or how bats sleep. Or it could be a kind of very grand, quite difficult series of talks about economic planning from John Maynard Keynes, or it could be some great literary figure talking about kind of the latest novels and so on. So it was quite, quite a wide range of stuff: music, dance, classical, talks, speech, children's, and so on. It gradually obviously coheres into a sort of schedule of regular series and so on. And certainly within a few years, the BBC has certain sort of hit series. And in the 1930s, you have, big comedy shows, variety shows. One of the great famous ones in the 1930s was In Town Tonight. It was the Saturday night variety show, a live mix of celebrity guests. It would be a kind of a chimney sweep from London, and then Cary Grant over from Hollywood, and a band playing in the studio, and so on. So the kind of the model of the kind of
like our late night talk shows.
Yeah, and it sounds familiar, right? I mean, these formats were being developed in the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, what tends to happen then in the Second World War is it becomes absolutely vital that people are listening to the BBC. I mean, that some of the theatres are shut down and so on. The BBC is going to be the main resource for people to get not just up-to-date news, but to sustain the morale, and not just of people at home, but of people living in occupied Europe and so on. So the BBC has to learn increasingly, it has to be really agile about trying to speak to its listeners in a way that feels comfortable for them. It has to become increasingly accessible and informal and so on. It starts off in 1922 as a kind of a minority interest for predominantly middle-class people. By the 1930s, it's got a big national audience, much more working class, and the BBC has to speak in a way that feels not too austere and forbidding for that large working class audience. So there's a steady evolution of the BBC learning to be in tune with its audience. Even though it's not famously giving the audience exactly what they want, it is, as Reith said, giving the audience sometimes what they need.
Challenging them a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. But it's always a mixture of both. It can't be too far ahead of what the audience needs. It has to be a balance of, someone once said at the BBC, it was in the 1970s, they said, does the BBC lead or follow? It has to do both. Mm-hmm. And that, again, is something that distinguishes it from, say, commercial broadcasting, or even kind of a small scale public broadcasting, which can, I think knows it's got a niche audience and can super serve that niche audience. The BBC really has got the challenge of trying to be all things to all people, and in a way, that is what makes it so interesting to the historian, you know.
So, within a short span of less than 20 years, we go from this startup to something that's really considered essential and indispensable in the Second World War. What was the BBC doing during World War II that made it this essential critical service for people living in the UK?
Well, I think first of all, it's important that it was seen now to be a vital source of news and information. So that was partly that, the government, as it were, had information it needed to get to as many people as possible. Information about rationing, about air raids, about what they should do, about how they needed to come up with new recipes, if food wasn't available, and so on. So there was kind of public information that had to reach people. And now the government weren't very good at this. I mean, the government would kind of tend to be a bit hectoring, and they'd kind of say, right, this is what you've got to do, pull your socks up, cook with these miserable bits of vegetables and not what you usually do.
Gee, thanks.
And this wasn't very successful. The BBC was stuffed full of people who knew how to make radio programs that were a bit more inviting and accessible. So there was a bit of a struggle at the beginning of the war when the BBC was trying to kind of say to the government, look, it's no good, these government officials going on air and just sort of basically shouting at people. What we need to do is to make this entertaining. And so they drew on their skills as broadcasters to kind of create comedy characters or entertaining programs that would, in a much more subtle way, dispense advice on how to build a air raid shelter or how to cook food with odd ingredients and so on. So there was that kind of, and that wasn't just about providing good information. What the BBC managed to do with that was that it managed to make the civilian population feel as if they too were part of the war effort. That that everything that they did wasn't just about coping with loss, but it was actually about helping to win the war in some way. So it was connected with the broader mission of morale boosting, and some of that involved comedy and music and escape from the war, if you like. So one of the great famous comedy series that the BBC put out during the war was called Itmar, which stood for It's That Man Again. And it was a kind of collection of comic characters. But what really made the series popular was that it actually kind of poked fun at the pomposity of officialdom. It provided a kind of release valve, if you like, for people who are fed up with being told what to do and for blacking out the windows to stop light from leaking during the bombing attacks and so on. So there was comedy as escape. There was another series that was very popular during the war called Music While You Work. And that was against all traditional notions from the BBC of what would be a good, proper music show. Producers were brought up to believe that, well, the important thing in a music show is that the music was carefully chosen, it was varied, it was introduced properly, it's curated, there would be an explanation of who made it and who composed it and so on. Music While You Work was on twice a day, just half an hour of non-stop, regular, rhythmic music. And it was piped into munitions factories around the country. And the idea it wasn't so much that it would kind of up the tempo of work, but it would just give morale a lift a couple of times a day when her effort was flagging a little bit. And it was incredibly popular among factory workers because it was a kind of a sing-along moment, if you like, that made this war work more bearable. And people at home loved it.
Shop today, it's like that.
Yeah, exactly. And people at home listened to it, and the people at home listened to it knowing that their friends and colleagues and family members in the factories were listening to it. So it was a sort of nation binding moment. So the BBC, the BBC was officially under kind of government control during the war because it was a national emergency, but it very quickly kind of exerted its own sort of rights, as it were, as the experts in broadcasting to kind of work out, how is this going to work? How is this going to work? We're not going to just become boring and austere and tell people what to do. We're going to actually try and, make this human in some way. And the other thing that is important to stress is that the BBC always was conscious that it was now an international broadcaster. It wasn't just about the home audience. 22 allied nations, the old British Empire and so on, and America. So there was the BBC's North American service, which provided programs to the US and to Canada, and was especially active when there were US and Canadian troops stationed in Britain. There were services for them, and of course broadcasts to Europe, occupied Europe. 46 languages being broadcast in Europe alone by the end of the war. Some 20 million people in Europe listening to the BBC.
And that has, I'm sorry.
Yes,
that has some strategic value.
And so I mean, from the BBC and the British government's point of view, it was about trying to provide accurate information about the course of the war. Now, again, there was a bit of tension here between the BBC and the government, because the government saw radio as the means of getting information to listeners in Europe. But their inclination was to kind of, suppress some military defeats, and to kind of exaggerate maybe the successes. Now, the BBC knew that people would only carry on listening if they trusted the BBC. And to be trusted, they had to be as honest as they could about military setbacks as well as victories. Now, the BBC couldn't always tell the full truth because there were certain bits of information that had to be, kept secret, but it would try to avoid untruths. And it was really important, I think, in the first half of the war, if the BBC could prove to its listeners in Europe, not just kind of say in occupied France, but actually listeners in enemy nations, I mean, German listeners, for instance, if they could prove that, to risk your life tuning into the BBC would allow you access to more accurate information than you're getting from, say, Nazi radio. Then in the later stages of the war, when actually the Allies were on the offensive more, then it would kind of come into its own. It would be even more useful for lots of people to be listening. So there was that. Now, there was another much more secret layer to what was going on in the broadcasting to Europe in the war. And that was that woven into the BBC's broadcasts to Europe were secret coded messages. Now, what that means is that the BBC received from military intelligence in the UK a series of coded messages, strange phrases, for instance, that would just be slotted into the script of programs broadcast to Europe. And these messages would send information to resistance fighters or to special operation executive members, in other words, British agents who are on the ground, to give information about the state of a sabotage action or whatever. And there were something like 50 to 100 of these messages a week going out to Europe that encouraged acts of resistance and sabotage and so on. But it was a complicated business because the BBC had to learn what was the kind of broadcasting that would work. If you're broadcasting to Germany in German, how could you get people who might be suspicious of Britain and British broadcasting to be listening? And they thought, long and hard. They sifted carefully the information that was coming back from Europe. They would, for instance, on the BBC's German service, they decided that it was extremely useful to include the names of captured German personnel, because that was a way of encouraging the families of those German military personnel to tune in, because they'd be keen to know, is my son alive or dead? Is he a prisoner of war, and so on. They learned to broadcast programs that targeted working class listeners in Germany, not just the kind of the elite. They wanted lots of people to be listening. The broadcasts to France were complicated by the fact that the BBC shared its transmission times, not just with its own French service, but with de Gaulle and his team of kind of exiled French. They had a sort of nightly slot on the BBC's transmitters, and they were kind of rather gung-ho and encouraging kind of rebellion and uprising and so on. Whereas the BBC was a little bit more restrained, and they were getting lots of messages from the UK government to say, look, there's not going to be a second front. There's not going to be an invasion. D-Day is not yet here. And actually the task of the BBC was to kind of lower expectations and to instill patience, as they put it, amongst French citizens. So in its extraordinarily rich history of broadcasters grappling with a determination, they were all on side, as it were. They wanted to win the war. This wasn't about kind of neutrality in some way, but using and learning so much about listener tastes and what worked, and trying constantly to set the BBC apart from pure propaganda. It was about the BBC trying to kind of, as it were, provide an example to embody kind of democratic principles in terms of varied viewpoints, argument, debate, but essentially a commitment to kind of democracy. So there was a lot going on in those broadcasts to Europe, at the same time as that really important work that the BBC had to do on the home front.
So the war part of the book I found particularly interesting. That was fascinating history there. After the war, though, how does the BBC handle, because the UK, just like the US, is changing a lot in those post-war years. You've got social change. In the case of Britain, you're dealing with decolonization. How does the BBC factor into that shifting listenership?
I think it's possible to look at that post-war era and to kind of see that in many respects the BBC is not necessarily at its best in the 1950s. I think it's possible to say that. So it comes out of the war with a kind of massive, hugely boosted international reputation, and as kind of central to British life. But what you've also got, I think, is, there's a delicate line between a sense of achievement and a kind of sense of complacency. And in the BBC, you're right, you've got a changing Britain, and you've also got at the BBC a sort of a pre-war generation still at work in terms of program making and so on. And it's possible, certainly when it comes to the issue of kind of Britain's increasingly multicultural identity. Britain has long been a multicultural nation, not, well before the war, but, you have larger scale immigration, particularly from India, Pakistan, and from the Caribbean. And this is a moment where you would expect the BBC to kind of serve public understanding. In other words, to kind of introduce the new communities to the old communities, introduce them to each other. The BBC is a little bit tentative about this and a little bit slow. And I think that's largely because, the reality is this is an organization where there are very, very, very few people of color, say, who were working for it in any influential program making departments. It is, as it were, largely blind to the issues of kind of multiculturalism in the late 40s and the 1950s. It does have, if you go through the program archive, there were plenty of programs about immigration, say, that in a very sincere way tried to explore the issue of racism and prejudice. But the kind of cumulative effect of a lot of these programs was to kind of constantly talk about Britain's new arrivals as, in some sense, a problem for the host community in some way. And it was a very long time, I think, before the BBC, actually had that sort of very different approach, which was actually to kind of think about what could Britain learn from its new arrivals, rather than what should Britain tell its new arrivals about how they had to behave. And there's something about the BBC, I think, that kind of explains this, which is that, and it goes back to what we were talking about in the 1920s, which is, if the BBC has sort of got at its heart this idea about trying to kind of, as it were, heal the nation, to hold society together, it's got a sort of natural aversion to pointing out differences. It kind of likes to slightly paper over the cracks, if you like, and draw attention to the good stuff. And sometimes that doesn't serve it well, because it tends to play down, some of those kind of demanding and important issues that divide us. And certainly then, I mean, we might say that much more recently, broadcasting embraces division and argument and so on, and draws attention to difference and so on.
Yeah, true. Leverage.
Yeah. But I mean, certainly then, I think that we were dealing with a BBC that was more comfortable with consensus than with difference. And I mean, but again, the BBC, this is an organisation that is producing a vast amount of output. It's got many radio channels and it's TV and it's, and so on. And lots of different languages. It's a global broadcaster. How can we characterize its total output? We've got to be very, very careful. And there was a wonderful radio series that the BBC put out in 1964, where the producer at the BBC collaborated with Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes, established, famous Harlem poet. He'd worked with the BBC during the Second World War, and he had a very close relationship with a BBC producer called Geoffrey Bridson, who was a jazz enthusiast and a poet and a radical politically. And they collaborated on a series of 19 programs that went out on the BBC in 1964, which explored the whole history and the present day status of the kind of African-American civil rights movement, African-American culture, music, art, poetry, politics, and so on. And it was a kind of, fantastic example, if you like, of the BBC really trying to kind of take seriously and explore in detail and at scale an important contemporary problem. I mean, what's interesting is that the BBC found it easier to look at the African-American civil rights movement than it did sometimes to look at the problems of race within Britain itself. So, I mean, there's an irony there, but also an indication that this was a BBC that was always trying, often imperfectly, to grapple with difficult issues.
All right, well, David, I've really enjoyed this discussion. This was a lot of fun. If you could take a moment to, if somebody's really interested in this, I know we kind of just covered the highlight reel of what's in the book. If they want to learn more about those things, where can they get a copy of your book?
Yes, well, I mean, I don't know. I guess I would say in all good bookshops, I hope.
Independent bookshops, for sure.
Yeah, independent bookshops and the usual online outlets, if that's what people want. But some good independent bookshops should stock it. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously hundreds of aspects of the BBC's history that we haven't touched on. And what can I say? Read the book if you want to find out more. There is something that I think is accessible to outside the UK, which is an online resource, and that's something called 100 Voices That Made the BBC. So if people wanted to Google 100 voices that made the BBC, they'd reach a website which is on the BBC. And it's something I worked with the BBC to write and create. And that's got loads, hundreds of clips from program archives and from the oral history collection that I mentioned. And essays, short blog style essays about early television, the BBC during wartime, the BBC in the Cold War, entertainment, pioneering women at the BBC. There's a section called People, Nation, Empire, which looks at the issue of the BBC and multiculturalism and so on. So it's rich in terms of its documents, its archives, its program material, its clips, its interviews, and so on. And as I understand it, that even though it's a BBC service funded by the license fee payer, I think it is accessible globally. So I'm hoping very much that people can have a look at that. And if they have any real questions that they want to ask, they can track me down and drop me an email, and I will try my best to respond.
Do you have a website?
I don't have a website, but I'm an emeritus professor at the University of Sussex in England. And so if people were to Google David Hendy, University of Sussex, there is a kind of web page there, which tells you a bit more about the work I'm doing, and allows you to see my email address, and I will try my best to respond to any inquiries.
All right. Well, David Hendy, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, there you have it, folks. The BBC with David Hendy. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to this show. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new. Big thank you to David for taking the time to talk with me about his book. What a wealth of knowledge, and what a fun and interesting guy to talk to. If you would like to learn more about the BBC, I have a link to his book, The BBC, A Century on the Air. The link is down in the description of this episode in your podcast app. I'm not kidding when I say that today we covered maybe 3 or 4 chapters of the book. There's a wealth of more material in there. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. Very interesting stuff. I hope that I'll see you guys again next week. We'll be looking at some legends of King Arthur. And then a little bit further down the road, we're going to be talking with author Mark Lee Gardner. And we are going to talk about... excuse me. We're going to be talking about Chief Sitting Bull and the Sioux Nation in the Lakotas. So I hope you'll stick with me for a couple weeks. Got some great stuff coming down the line. All right, until then, have a great week.